The iron coffins, the genesis of the mid-Atlantic terror. At 03 hours on September 3, 1939, a message pulsed through the salt water of the North Atlantic, encoded in the mechanical rotors of a machine the world would soon know as Enigma. The message was simple: total war on Allied shipping. For the 44 men trapped inside the vibrating steel hull of the U-30, the war had already begun. They were 200 miles west of the Hebrides, submerged in a darkness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. This wasn't a ship of the line. It was a Type XXI, a 600-ton predatory experiment. As the captain adjusted the periscope, he saw the silhouette of the passenger liner SS Athenia. He didn't see a target. He saw the first brick in a wall that would eventually starve a global empire. With a single whispered command, "Los," the first torpedo of the war left its tube. 112 people died that night. It was the birth of a new kind of slaughter, an industrial lethality that prioritized efficiency over honor. This is the narrative of the Grey Wolves. It is the story of how a handful of specialized mechanics and cold-blooded strategists turned the Atlantic Ocean into the largest graveyard on Earth. We aren't just looking at submarine specs today. We are stepping into the vibrating, grease-slicked reality of the iron coffins. We are analyzing the physics of underwater pressure, the chemical energy of the G7E torpedo, and the psychological calculation of Admiral Karl Dönitz. This is the hunt for survival in a lightless abyss, and the terrifying price of naval innovation. To understand the U-boat, you have to understand the man who made them a weapon of mass destruction, Admiral Karl Dönitz. In 1918, during the Great War, Dönitz was a prisoner in a British camp. He spent his days watching the movement of ships, and his nights obsessing over the mathematical failure of the Kaiser's navy. He realized that submarines acting as lone hunters were easy to trap, but submarines acting as a Paca Rudel could overwhelm any defense. He returned to Germany with a secret blueprint for a starvation war. He didn't want to fight the Royal Navy. He wanted to destroy the cargo that kept them alive. He calculated that if he could sink 300,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, the United Kingdom would collapse from starvation within 6 months. It was a war of calories, not just cannons. The creation of the Type 7 U-boat was an act of extreme engineering defiance. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forbidden from building submarines. But in the mid-1930s, under the cover of secret design offices in the Netherlands and Finland, they perfected the Type 7. It was the most balanced predator of the era. By 1940, the Type 7C became the backbone of the fleet. Let's talk about the lethality of the machine itself. The Type 7C was 220 feet of industrial intent. Its hull was made of Set 52 ship steel, capable of withstanding the crushing pressure of 220 meters of depth. Beyond that test depth, the rivets would begin to pop like bullets, and the hull would implode in a fraction of a second. The propulsion system was a hybrid masterpiece. 2 massive MAN M6V 4046 diesel engines for surface travel, and 2 electric motors for silent running underwater. On the surface, it could reach 17 knots, allowing it to shadow slow-moving convoys for days. But underwater, it was a ghost, crawling at 4 knots to avoid detection by British ASDIC, the early sonar. The true lethality, however, lay in the nose. The Type 7C carried 5 torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow, 1 in the stern. These tubes housed the G7E electric torpedo. This was a 23-foot, 1.5-ton nightmare. Unlike the steam-powered torpedoes of the previous war, the G7E left no wake of bubbles. It was invisible. It traveled at 30 knots, powered by lead-acid batteries that required constant maintenance in the humid, salt-heavy air of the submarine. Inside the warhead was 617 pounds of Schiesswolle, a high-explosive compound designed for one thing, the water hammer effect. To understand the water hammer, you have to understand the physics of an underwater explosion. When the G7E struck a ship's hull below the waterline, it didn't just punch a hole. It created a gas bubble that expanded and contracted violently. This created a shock wave that didn't travel through the air, but through the water, which is incompressible. The pressure would lift the entire 10,000-ton cargo ship out of the water and then drop it. The force was so immense, it would snap the steel keel of a merchant vessel like a dry twig. The ship wouldn't just sink. It would break in half and vanish in under 5 minutes. This was mechanical execution at its most efficient. But life inside the iron coffin was its own kind of hell. 44 men lived in a space smaller than a modern city bus. There was no shower. There were 2 toilets. But for the first 3 weeks of a mission, one was used to store food. The air was a toxic cocktail of diesel fumes, sweat, and battery acid. Condensation would rain from the ceiling, causing electrical fires and rotting the men's skin. They slept in shifts on bunks that were still warm from the previous man. The humidity was so high that bread would turn green with mold within days. Yet these men were the elite. They were the Gray Wolves, and by late 1940, they had entered what they called the first happy time. Donitz's strategy was focused on a specific geographic weakness in the Allied defense. In the center of the Atlantic, there was a region 600 miles wide where Allied aircraft could not reach. They called it the Black Pit. It was the perfect hunting ground. The wolf packs would wait in long lines, hundreds of miles across, perpendicular to the convoy routes. When one U-boat spotted a silhouette on the horizon, it didn't attack immediately. It would stay on the surface, just outside the range of the British lookouts, and broadcast a continuous signal. Donitz, sitting in his headquarters in Lorient, France, would then coordinate every nearby boat to converge on the target. In October 1940, the lethality of this tactic reached its peak. In a single night, convoy SC-7 was intercepted by a pack of 7 U-boats. In the darkness, the submarines didn't stay underwater. They attacked on the surface. They were faster, smaller, and harder to see than the escorts. Within 6 hours, 20 out of 35 ships were sent to the bottom. 140,000 tons of supplies vanished. For every German sailor lost, they were killing 30 Allied merchant seamen. The British were losing ships faster than they could build them. Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever truly frightened him. He knew that if the Gray Wolves could maintain this kill rate, the war was over. If this first look into the dark heart of the Atlantic War, the mechanical precision, and the human suffering of the U-boats has moved you, please hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that these forgotten stories of steel and sacrifice deserve to be told. We are rescuing these narratives from the dusty archives every single day, and please subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss Part 2, where the War of the Codes begins and the Wolfpacks enter their deadliest phase. Back to the abyss. By early 1941, the German U-boat arm was no longer just a naval force. It was a high-tech industrial complex. But the British were about to strike back with something more powerful than depth charges. They were going to steal the Germans' mind. They were going for the Enigma. The narrative continues into Part 2, delving into the capture of U-110, the cracking of the Enigma code at Bletchley Park, and the escalation of the Mid-Atlantic slaughter. The Code War and the American Shambles. Operation Drumbeat. By early 1941, the Atlantic was no longer just a battlefield of steel. It had become a battlefield of mathematics. The Gray Wolves were winning because they were invisible, not just to the eye, but to the mind. Every move the wolf packs made was dictated by the Enigma machine, a 26-pound box of rotors and wires that turned German commands into a 1,000,000,000,000 cipher. To the British Admiralty, the Atlantic was a black hole where ships simply vanished without a whisper. They weren't just fighting submarines, they were fighting a ghost in the machine. But on May 9, 1941, the ghost took a physical form. This is the narrative of the capture of U-110, the breaking of the Enigma, and the moment the hunters realized the prey could finally see them. The capture of U-110 remains one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. During a fierce battle over convoy OB-318, the British destroyer HMS Bulldog forced the U-110 to the surface with a barrage of depth charges. The German captain, Julius Lemp, believing his boat was about to be rammed and sunk, gave the order to abandon ship. In the chaos of the freezing spray and machine gun fire, Lemp jumped into the water, but he realized too late that the Bulldog hadn't rammed his boat. A British boarding party was rowing toward it. Lemp turned back, swimming desperately toward his sinking sub to destroy the secret documents, but he was never seen again. Some say he was shot, others say he simply disappeared into the abyss. Inside the oily, dark hull of U-110, the British found the holy grail of naval intelligence, a functional Enigma machine, and the top-secret code books for the entire month of June. They didn't even tell the Americans. They rushed the prize to Bletchley Park, where a team of mathematicians led by Alan Turing began to peel back the layers of the Nazi mind. For the first time, the Royal Navy could hear the wolves breathing. They could see the lines being formed. The lethality of the U-boat began to wane as convoys were diverted around the killing zones. But just as the British began to breathe, the war changed. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and Admiral Dönitz saw an opportunity for a slaughter so great it would make the first happy time look like a practice run. Dönitz called it Operation Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. He sent his long-range Type XXI U-boats across the ocean to the doorstep of the United States. He expected a fight. What he found was a massacre. In January 1942, the U.S. Navy was completely unprepared for submarine warfare. Despite the warnings from London, the American cities along the coast refused to implement blackouts. From New York to Miami, the neon signs, street lights, and boardwalks remained blazing. For the U-boat captains, it was the second happy time. They didn't even need their periscopes. They sat on the surface at night, watching the silhouettes of American tankers and freighters pass in front of the bright city lights. It was like shooting ducks in a gallery. The lethality of Operation Drumbeat was staggering. In the first 6 months of 1942, the Gray Wolves sank 609 ships off the American coast, nearly 3.1 million tons of shipping. This wasn't just a military loss, it was an industrial catastrophe. Tankers carrying millions of gallons of oil were torpedoed within sight of vacationers on the New Jersey beaches. The survivors who made it to shore brought stories of a sea that was literally on fire. The American public was in shock, yet the U.S. Navy Admiral Ernest King refused to adopt the convoy system, calling it defensive and cowardly. His ego was paid for in the blood of merchant sailors. Let's analyze the mechanics of these kills. In the shallow waters of the U.S. coast, the U-boats used a tactic called surface sneaking. Because American radar was primitive, the U-boats would remain on the surface, using their diesel engines to outrun the slow coastal patrol boats. They would fire their deck guns, the 105mm monster on the Type XXI, to save their expensive torpedoes. A single 105mm shell could turn a wooden hull into splinters or puncture the thin skin of a tanker, leading to a massive secondary explosion. Some U-boat aces like Reinhard Hartigan in U-123 became legends. Hartigan actually brought his boat so close to New York City that his crew could see the Empire State Building. He sank 7 ships in a single week. To the Germans, the American coast was the great American turkey shoot. Inside the boats, the mood had shifted from desperation to arrogance. They were the masters of the ocean, but the arrogance hid a darker reality. Every mission was still a gamble with death. A single mechanical failure, a single depth charge hitting the right spot, and the 50 men inside would experience a death that is hard for the human mind to process. When a U-boat hull is breached at depth, the incoming water doesn't just fill the room, it arrives with the force of a hydraulic cutter. It can slice a human body in half. If the batteries are flooded, they release chlorine gas, burning the lungs of the crew before they can drown. This was the duality of the gray wolves. They were the ultimate predators, but they lived inside their own graves. If this look into the American shambles and the secret war of the Enigma has gripped you, please hit that like button. We are reconstructing these events from thousands of pages of archival records to bring you the truth behind the steel. Every like helps us reach more history enthusiasts, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We are heading into the climax of the War Part 3, where the Allies finally strike back with the Black Pit Hunters and the introduction of the escort carriers. Back to the slaughter. By mid-1942, the United States finally woke up. They enforced blackouts, they started convoys, and they began to build ships faster than donuts could sink them. The war of attrition was turning into a war of production. The gray wolves were about to face a new kind of enemy, a hunter that could fly. Dönitz knew the happy time was over. He ordered his engineers to find a way to stay underwater longer. He needed a miracle. He needed the schnorkel. But the British had another surprise. They had developed Lee lights, massive searchlights mounted on bombers that could turn night into day in a split second. The U-boats, which relied on the darkness of night to recharge their batteries on the surface, were being caught like deer in headlights. The lethality was shifting. The hunter was becoming the hunted, and the iron coffins were about to become very crowded. The closing gap. When the hunter becomes the prey. By late 1942, the Atlantic Ocean had become a vast, churning laboratory for the most lethal technological race in human history. For 3 years, the gray wolves had owned the darkness, slipping through the Allied nets with the predatory grace of sharks. But the math of the war was shifting. Admiral Karl Dönitz, sitting in his bunker, watched the red pins on his map with growing anxiety. The pins represented his U-boats, and they were beginning to disappear at a rate that defied his calculations. The Allies weren't just building more ships, they were building a new kind of war. This is the narrative of the closing of the Mid-Atlantic Gap, the introduction of the escort carriers, and the moment the iron coffins began to live up to their terrifying name. To understand the downfall of the U-boat, you have to understand the power of the sky. For years, the Black Pit, that 600-mile stretch of water in the middle of the Atlantic, was a sanctuary for the wolf packs. No Allied plane had the range to reach it. But in 1943, that sanctuary was annihilated. The British and Americans introduced the VLR Liberator Very Long Range B-24s, equipped with extra fuel tanks and the secret H-2S centimetric radar. These planes could stay in the air for 20 hours, patrolling the very heart of the gap. The lethality of the air-to-sea transition was instantaneous. A U-boat on the surface was a sitting duck. Imagine the crew of a Type XXI, finally surfacing after 20 hours of submerged hell to recharge their batteries and breathe fresh air. The sun is just rising. Suddenly, a 4-engine bomber drops out of the clouds at 200 miles per hour. The U-boat needs 30 seconds to perform a crash dive. The Liberator needs only 5 seconds to drop a stick of 6 250-pound Torpex depth charges. The physics of these attacks were brutal. If a depth charge exploded within 30 feet of the hull, the overpressure was enough to rupture the main ballast tanks and crack the battery casings. The U-boat wouldn't just sink. It would be pinned to the bottom of the ocean, its crew slowly suffocating as chlorine gas filled the compartments. But the Allies didn't stop with land-based planes. They introduced the escort carrier, the Jeep carrier. These were small, mass-produced aircraft carriers built on merchant hulls. They carried a handful of Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers. Now the convoys had their own personal air force. A U-boat couldn't even get close enough to see the convoy before a Wildcat was strafing its deck with 50 caliber rounds, forcing it to dive and lose its tactical position. The lethality of the wolf pack depended on surface speed. Submerged, a U-boat was slower than the ships it was trying to kill. By forcing them to stay underwater, the Allied air cover effectively castrated the German attack. Inside the submarines, the psychological toll was becoming unmanageable. The veterans called it Paukenschlag Kater, the drumbeat hangover. The arrogance of 1941 was gone, replaced by a cold, vibrating fear. The men were no longer gray wolves, they were mice in a cage. Every time the ASDIC pinged against the hull, it sounded like a hammer hitting a coffin. ASDIC. The British sonar had evolved. It wasn't just finding the boats, it was calculating their depth and speed with terrifying precision. Let's analyze the new lethality of the escort destroyers. They were now equipped with the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that fired 24 projectiles ahead of the ship. Unlike traditional depth charges, which were dropped off the back, the Hedgehog allowed the destroyer to keep its sonar contact on the U-boat until the very moment of impact. The Hedgehog rounds only exploded if they hit the submarine's hull. This meant the ocean remained quiet, allowing the sonar operators to stay locked on their prey. If a single Hedgehog round hit, it would punch a 6-inch hole through the pressure hull. At 150 meters deep, that hole would invite a jet of water with enough pressure to cut through steel beams and human bone. Admiral Dönitz tried to fight back with technology. He introduced the Schnorkel, a breathing tube that allowed U-boats to run their diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth. It was an engineering masterpiece, but a physiological disaster. If the intake valve accidentally closed due to a wave, the massive diesel engines would suck the air directly out of the submarine's interior in seconds, bursting the eardrums of the crew and causing them to collapse from a sudden vacuum. It was a desperate solution for a desperate war. But perhaps the most significant blow to the Grey Wolves was the Huff-Duff high-frequency direction finding. The British had learned that U-boats had to talk to each other to form a pack. Every time a U-boat transmitted a radio signal to Dönitz, the British Huff-Duff stations on the convoy's escort ships would instantly triangulate its exact position. The Germans believed their signals were too fast to be caught. They were wrong. The lethality of the wolf pack was its coordination. By listening to that coordination, the Allies turned the Germans' greatest strength into their fatal weakness. Inside the boats, the casualty rates were climbing into the realm of the impossible. By May 1943, known as Black May, Dönitz lost 41 U-boats in a single month. That is one boat every 18 hours. 2,000 experienced sailors vanished. Some boats simply never reported back. They weren't sunk in spectacular battles. They were just gone, crushed by the weight of the Atlantic or silenced by a single well-placed depth charge. The average life expectancy of a U-boat sailor was now less than 3 missions. They had a 75% chance of never coming home. If this narrative of the technological turning point, the moment when human ingenuity was turned toward the systematic destruction of the gray wolves, has moved you, please hit that like button. We are reconstructing the lethal physics of the Atlantic War to ensure these stories are never lost to time. Every like and every share helps us honor the thousands of men on both sides who were swallowed by the abyss. And if you haven't subscribed, do it now. We are moving toward the final tragic climax, Part 4, where we witness the last stand of the U-boats and the discovery of their rusted remains decades later. Back to the slaughter. In May 1943, Admiral Dönitz realized the war was lost. He ordered his boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic. He told his superiors, "The enemy has rendered the U-boat war impossible." But the war didn't stop. He sent his men back out in new experimental boats, the Type XXI, Elektroboot, a machine so advanced it could have changed the war if it had arrived a year earlier. But time was the one resource the Third Reich couldn't manufacture. The gray wolves were entering their final winter, and the Atlantic was ready to claim the rest of them. The lethality was now a one-way street. The Allies were sinking U-boats faster than the German shipyards could replace them. The iron coffins were being hunted by night and day, by air and sea. The narrative of the predator was over. The narrative of the ghost had begun. The last stand, the Elektroboot and the end of the hunters. By the winter of 1944, the Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground. It was a mass grave. The gray wolves, once the undisputed masters of the lightless deep, were being hunted with a mechanical precision that bordered on the divine. Admiral Karl Dönitz, now Commander-in-Chief of the entire German Navy, sat in his bunker and realized the math had reached its terminal point. In 1940, it took one U-boat to sink 10 Allied ships. By 1944, it took 10 U-boats to sink one Allied ship, and most of those boats never came home. The iron coffins were no longer just a metaphor. They were a reality for 28,000 German sailors who were now a permanent part of the Atlantic seabed. But the Third Reich had one last desperate card to play. A machine so advanced it didn't belong in the 1940s, a machine that would change the nature of naval warfare forever. This is the narrative of the Type XXI Elektroboot, the final extinction of the wolf packs and the rusted legacy of the men who fought in the dark. To understand the desperation of 1945, you have to understand the failure of the Type 7. The boats that had terrorized Churchill were essentially surface ships that could dive for short periods. But the Allies had conquered the surface. If a U-boat surfaced to breathe, it died. Dönitz needed a true submarine. He needed the Type XXI. This wasn't an evolution, it was a revolution. The Type XXI was the first submarine designed to spend its entire mission underwater. It featured 8 times the battery capacity of the Type 7. It had a creep motor so silent that it could slip underneath a destroyer's sonar like a ghost. But its true lethality was in the nose. The Type XXI featured a hydraulic rapid reload system. In a standard U-boat, it took the crew nearly 20 minutes of backbreaking manual labor to reload a single torpedo tube. The Type XXI could reload all 6 of its bow tubes in under 4 minutes. It could fire a spread of 18 torpedoes in less than half an hour. The physics of this firepower were staggering. A single Type XXI had the lethality of an entire 1941 Wolfpack. It could dive to 280 meters, well beyond the reach of most Allied depth charges. It was faster underwater than most merchant ships were on the surface. If Donitz had 300 of these in 1943, the English language might be a minority tongue in London today. But engineering genius cannot overcome industrial collapse. The Type XXI was built using a revolutionary modular system. Different sections were built in factories across Germany and then shipped to the coast to be welded together. It was a method used by Paul Gunn for his B-25 modifications' modular efficiency applied to mass destruction. But the Allied bombers were now hitting the canals, the railways, and the factories. Out of 118 boats built, only 2 ever made it to a combat patrol before the end. The war of production had been won by the American shipyards and the British codebreakers. The Grey Wolves were out of time. In the final months, the lethality of the Atlantic War turned into a one-sided slaughter. The Allies introduced the Squid, a triple-barreled mortar that fired 100-pound depth charges that were triggered by an automated sonar computer. The human element was being removed from the kill. The U-boat crews were now teenagers, boys with 6 weeks of training sent into a meat grinder that had already consumed their fathers. The air over the Bay of Biscay was thick with Allied planes. Some U-boat captains began to commit suicide rather than face another patrol. They knew that once they submerged, the chances of seeing the sun again were less than 10%. On May 4, 1945, the command finally came from Donitz. Operation Regenbogen. It was the order to scuttle. He didn't want his Grey Wolves to become trophies. Across the coast of Norway and Germany, 232 U-boats were open to the sea. The crews stood on the shore and watched their boats, their homes, their prisons, sink into the gray water. They wept, not for the regime, but for the Polat Gigantlar that had defined their lives. It was the end of the greatest naval campaign in history. Let's analyze the final lethality of the Atlantic campaign. The numbers are a punch to the gut. Out of 156 U-boats built by Germany, 784 were lost. Out of 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, 28,000 died. That is a 70% fatality rate, the highest of any branch of any military in World War II. On the Allied side, 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships were sent to the bottom. Over 72,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen were swallowed by the Atlantic. This wasn't a war of glory. It was a war of attrition where the currency was human life and thousands of tons of sunken steel. But the story didn't end in 1945. The Allies didn't want the U-boats to remain even as wrecks. In late 1945, they launched Operation Deadlight. They gathered the surrendered U-boats, the legendary Type 7s, the deadly Type 9s, and the futuristic Type XXI, and towed them out into the deep water off the coast of Ireland. One by one, they were used as target practice or simply blown up. The Royal Navy wanted to ensure the Grey Wolves were truly dead. They wanted the Atlantic to be silent again. If this final chapter in the saga of the Grey Wolves, the narrative of their technological peak and their ultimate extinction, has moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button. We spend hundreds of hours digging through these dusty archives to ensure that the lethality and the sacrifice of these men are never forgotten. Every like helps us bring history back to life. And hit subscribe with notifications on. We are rescuing the forgotten stories of the men who fought in the dark, and we have many more to tell. The legacy of the U-boat lives on in every modern submarine today. The American Nautilus, the Soviet Typhoons, the British Astute class, they all carry the DNA of the Type XXI Elektroboot. The silent motors, the streamlined hulls, the rapid reload tubes, all of it was born in the desperation of the German shipyards in 1944. But the real legacy is found 15,000 feet deep. In 1989, when Robert Ballard was not looking for the Bismarck, he was looking for the ghosts of the Atlantic. He found them: rusted hulls, silent torpedo tubes, and the final resting places of thousands of sailors who never got closer to home than a periscope's view. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the UK, Germany, or Australia? We want to know our community. Tell us if someone in your family was a merchant mariner or served in the Navy. You are the keepers of this history. We are not just viewers. We are the memory of the deep. Thank you for making sure the gray wolves and the men who hunted them don't disappear into silence. These men on both sides of the steel deserve to be remembered. We'll see you in the next deep dive into the archives. Stay curious. Stay informed.